So this section now, what we are calling as the PhD continuum, will require some attention. So I suggest that I hope everybody has come back. Okay, before we begin, first of all there is a note about the role of subject knowledge. Okay. Often we are saying that look, PhD is extending the knowledge of the subject, right? So in this workshop, we are assuming that you are an expert in your research area, and the workshop is actually a human view rather than a knowledge view of the PhD research, because we are talking about how can you guide students once you become a PhD guide or a MTech or a master student guide. So as a note to students, you are expected to acquire the subject knowledge in your own area. And as a note to guides, so the role of subject knowledge is considered to be part of or within your research agenda itself. So I am not going to be talking separately about the importance or the role of subject knowledge in the PhD. So we will talk about some of the other factors. Okay. So now if you look at the PhD continuum, right, as a student, at one end of the spectrum, many of us have experienced that the PhD is actually totally predetermined, right, based on what the advisor's research direction is, what kind of problems the advisor is interested in. And at another end, we also have seen PhD guides who are open-ended and who pick problems based on students' interests. So as a student, we are familiar with this continuum. And in between, there are multiple points. In between, there are advisors who talk about mostly predetermined topics but provide some flexibility, while others are mostly open-ended, but they still put some boundaries around their work, okay, or what a student can do. So we are all familiar with these categories as a student, right? So now the question is, recall your own PhD student days and your own interaction with your guide, and think about how much flexibility did you have, thereby identifying your guide's position on the continuum. So as you can see from the graph, most guides fall in this area of mostly flexible with some boundaries, or sometimes it is mostly predetermined with some flexibility, right? So very rarely do we find people who are at the absolute extreme of either of the continuum. So now moving on, let us try to look at it from the other end. Once again, now recall your PhD student days and write down one or two key points about your expectation from your guide. Okay. So this is again a Mentimeter activity. So the reason for doing this activity is for you to then be aware of what your students might expect from you. You can just write short sentences. Motivating, showing a positive role model, validating ideas, knowledge, encouraging, patient, empathetic way, kickstart, regular scientific feedback, help in soft skills, being a mentor, nudging in a systematic way, helping to navigate bottlenecks, guide me at crucial points, getting clarity, helping hand in innovation, safety net than guardrails, availability for discussion, open to hearing other viewpoints, allowing meandering but providing boundaries, be invested in my research as much as I am, knows my weaknesses and strengths. Okay, 2-3 more responses we'll wait for before we move on. Motivate towards research, give constructive feedback, reassure that the progress is in the right direction, channeling to work. Okay, so now as you see that these are the expectations that you have or you had from your guide, right? So similarly, your students will have similar expectations from you. Okay, so these responses actually match up with some responses from a prior survey that I had conducted. So one thread of responses was about freedom to explore multiple topics, being open and flexible while deciding the topic, make me feel that I am in the driving seat of the PhD, providing opportunities to work on projects, right? So many of these points you have also found. Then there were points about being aware of the students' aim, being able to help them with failures and scaffold their growth, a critical but positive and constructive approach, okay, a mirror that shows you your strengths and weaknesses. So once again, many of your response have been along similar lines. So the point here is, if we look at what is happening here, most student responses are about individual growth, and we find that recognition for research is a side effect, okay, as far as the student is concerned. And when we become guides, we must keep this in mind that one, what does the student expect from us when we become a guide? Okay. So now let's look at the view from a guide's perspective. Okay, so we are on the other side of the table, and from the guide's perspective, there are several criteria that need to be considered. The first one is the guide's own goals, right? What is it that you want to do? You know, where do you want to go as a researcher? Where do you want to be as a teacher? Okay. Then there are criteria related to the student's characteristics, right? What are the student's goals? What are their strengths? How much flexibility should you provide? So these are typical concerns that a guide has. And then there are institutional concerns, like what does the institute want me to do? What are the promotion criteria? These are also very important things to keep in mind. As well as, you know, what is happening in the field? What are peer researchers doing? What are they doing? What is a current hot area in my broad area of work? All of these are criteria that a guide needs to keep in mind to choose a problem for a particular student. So the implication of this is that for different students, you may have to take different positions at different times, you know, based on what is the answer of having considered many such questions. Okay, so this sounds like a very complex thing. So actually it is. So it is a multidimensional view, and if you think of it geometrically, it's a point in a multidimensional space where on one axis can be the focus on your own research agenda, on another axis can be the focus on the student's growth, on a third axis there could be the student's abilities and other aspects, a fourth axis might be what the institute wants you to do, and so on and so forth. And since this is a complex view, what we are doing is that for simplicity, we will reduce this to looking at the positions or 4 points in this space, which is what we call as the continuum. Okay. So once again, there are multiple aspects that a guide has to consider for deciding what is their position for a particular student, and in this case we are reducing it to a linear 4 points on a linear scale for simplicity of understanding. So what are these 4 points? So at one end of the spectrum is someone whose primary focus is on their own research agenda. So this person will look for a student with suitable skills, and I call this person a researcher who also does teaching. Their primary goal is research. At the other end of the spectrum could be a person whose primary focus is on the student's growth, and this person would look for a research problem that is suitable for the student. Okay, so I call this person a teacher who also does research. Okay. And it is to be noted that no guide is likely to be at either extreme. As you saw even from your own responses to what was your guide's position, no one is likely to be at an extreme, but it is useful to look at the extremes and then move inwards. So what are the other points? So there are two other points. One could be a somewhat flexible research agenda. It is more or less defined by the guide, but there is flexibility. So the guide will significantly factor in the student's interest. So there may be multiple aspects to a particular research agenda. So depending upon the student's interest, the student could pick up, student could have a choice in terms of what direction they pick. On the other hand, there could also be a guide who's take a position of a highly flexible research agenda, where this person is likely to work mostly with ideas that are exciting to the student. Okay, so these are 4 points on the continuum, which is a simplification for us to be able to understand what is this continuum and what role does it play in the guide-student interaction. So each point has its pros and cons, and there is no such point which is better than the other. So it is up to each one of us as guides to choose our position on this continuum, either for our own work or for a particular student. Okay, so now to give you an example, where am I on the continuum? So I have a highly flexible research agenda, and my primary focus is the student's learning and growth while they are going through the PhD process. So to give you a quick analogy, there is a notion of a tour guide versus an expedition leader. So the expedition leader is one type of a guide who's going ahead on their own research, and those who join the expedition pick up a lot of skills and they also get to become experts in that area. Okay. On the other hand, there could be somebody who is more of a who helps you to reach your destination. So that's what I am calling as a tour guide versus an expedition leader analogy roughly. Okay. So now what does it mean to have a highly flexible research agenda? Okay. So in my case, when I was in computer science, I had PhD students working on varied areas. I had some interest and prior expertise in these areas, but I was not an established researcher in them. So I developed my expertise along with the student. Then I moved to EdTech, okay, and started the process all over again. So here the example could be that, we'll work with ideas exciting to the students. Some students wanted to work on bilingual education, others wanted to work on tinkering or visual analytics or teacher training. So there is a whole wide spectrum of topics on which I have guided students. So that is what it means to have a highly flexible research agenda. So my primary focus is on the students' learning and growth as a person, as a thinker and so on. And so I am flexible enough to pick a topic which the student is deeply interested in. Okay. So now each position comes with some pros and cons. So what are the pros and cons of this position? Okay. So in this case, I accept the disadvantages of not aligning multiple students in the same direction. Okay. So if you look at the pros and cons, a lot of learning happens, technical and non-technical, for the student. Okay. So both the student and the guide are generally happy with this position. Students often stay motivated to work. They learn many tangible and intangible skills, they gain confidence in many respects, venture into new areas, and are typically unafraid to attempt hard problems. Many of my students have validated this point as they went on after their PhD. And personally, I get a kick out of seeing their growth as students and their achievements as an alumni. So this to me is a personal and important pro. Now if we come to look at the cons, so a strong and sustained long-term research output in one given area is unlikely. Okay? So it's not, because with each student you are working on a different area which is focused on the student's interest. So in this case, both the advisor and student pay a price for this, because the advisor is not very well known in that particular student's area. Okay. This is also not efficient for metrics such as publications, because each student may use a different method, they may target different conferences and journals depending on the problem. So each time you are kind of starting from the basics, or and as I mentioned, the student pays a price for not having a guide who is already well known in their area of interest. No? So what is the advantage of having a guide who is already well known? Because that guide is already established as an expert, as a researcher. So this person might be able to open up opportunities for you, right? Like postdoctoral opportunities or connecting you to other labs and so on. So when taking a highly flexible position, these are the pros and these are the cons that, it's an example that I am aware of. Okay. So naturally now the next question arises is, what are the pros and cons of some other position on the continuum? So let's quickly take a look. So let's look at a guide who has a somewhat flexible research agenda. So they have a strong research agenda with some flexibility. So now in this case, the guide may already be an established researcher in the area, so the student gets the benefit of the guide's expertise and position in the community. If you look at the cons, the student may have to fit their goals into the guide's research agenda. Some students are able to do it well, some students have their own idea on which they want to work. Okay? So the student's choice in terms of the research problem or the research direction that they want to take for their PhD may reduce. Okay. So if you want to look at more details, let's do the next activity. So this activity is, write down some points about where you would like to be on the continuum, okay, and analyze the pros and cons of your position. This is the second question to which you will have to submit your answer as part of assignment 1. So you can write it in your own document on a paper, or you can use the same link posted earlier for the class responses and write your responses in that, so that you can look at some other people's responses also. You can take 5 minutes for this activity.